Welcome to the Tank Podcast. I'm Tina, Tank's resident voiceover artist. This week, Geoff Dyer reads from his book The Last Days of Roger Federer and Other Endings, his elegiac tribute to tennis, music, and disintegration.
Few pieces of music change more gradually or subtly than the Disintegration Loops by William Basinski. In the first of these, a very simple melody, lasting perhaps 6 seconds, is looped over and over. It sounds like a recording of a melancholy brass band, with parts of the past from which it was exhumed still clinging to it. With some reverb and other small, very subtle treatments, the loop continues to unfold, but as it does so, the sound quality slowly and imperceptibly deteriorates. After about 50 minutes, the melody is struggling to make itself heard at all, but hangs on tenaciously as we cling to its residual beauty. By the end, there is so little left that what we hear is almost indistinguishable from the memory of what had been imprinting itself on our memory over the previous 50 minutes. The loops were created partly by accident while Basinski had been digitalizing some old taped loops of Muzak. As the tape was playing, bits of metal began to flake off, so that each time it passed through the tape head, it physically deteriorated still further. The loops are the audible recollections or documentary records of this process. It was almost like the core of this melody was trying to hold on till the very end, he has said. The deterioration or shrinking in quality of the few endlessly repeated seconds of melody is countered by the way that they are allowed to expand in time so that the closed loop acquires the quality of narrative in the process of that narrative passively and actively consuming itself. Adorno noticed something similar in Beethoven's late style, a tendency towards dissociation, decay, dissolution, but not in the sense of a process of composition which no longer holds things together. The disassociation and disintegration themselves become artistic means, said Adorno. Every added moment of the tape survival is also an additional increment of self-destruction. The last instants of the piece are latent in the first, and the residue of that first moment is still there, even in its almost total extinction. Towards the end, there is, unless I'm mistaken, a gradual acceleration of decay as pieces of the tape fell off more quickly. This corresponds to the way that a toilet roll runs out more quickly towards the end, because a full loop consists of less and less paper, barely half a sheet by the end, compared with 2 at the outset, as the roll shrinks and gets closer to the narrow circumference of the empty cardboard core. Or, to avoid lowering the tone like this, it's similar to the experience of time accelerating as we get older, with each year consisting of a smaller and smaller percentage of one's life. The pace of decay accelerates in the disintegration loops, while time, the almost imperceptible beat of the music, the duration of the loop, remains constant. What increases is the space between what remains recognizable as music. We were in London for the hottest day and night of the year, sitting on our terrace, listening to the first disintegration loop. The sky still glowed with the twilight which, the nights being so short, looked like it might hang around till the first hint of dawn. To the east, Trellick Tower was bright with lights, starkly beautiful though not as lovely as it had been a few weeks earlier, when the service tower had been bathed in green light as a memorial to Grenfell, also visible across the roofs, slightly west and south of us. Planes left the residue of vapour trails in the almost darkness. There was a sickle of moon with a faint halation. On the chimney stack we'd hung red fairy lights, magical and hazy. Years ago I had painted the chimney stack a hippie-ish purple. Under the influence of the lights it was wine dark. The whole scene was like a nightclub or bar, very low-key, with no alcoholic drinks and just 2 customers who were also the staff. As the night darkened, the red of the fairy lights glowed more brightly, but always gently. The music looped and continued, all the time deteriorating, in the process of consuming itself. I was in my early 60s, wearing a t-shirt and shorts. In the past, this is exactly the kind of scene I've written about, created or recreated with lyricism and romance. Over time, that's diminished, disintegrated, both the actual experience and my ability to render it. What remains are the facts. There were no stars. Lying on my back, on a bench, in a field in Tuscany, looking up at the stars, listening to Beethoven's String Quartet in A minor, opus 132. We'd come here on the sleeper train from Vienna, where we'd taken a tram to Beethoven's grave. The grave was marked by a big obelisk or something, and it was obvious immediately that there was no point in having come. Even with the added proximity of Schubert snuggled up next door, the place had 0 power. In the past, I'd made a point of visiting graves: Joseph Brodsky in Venice, Jim Morrison in Père Lachaise, Jean Rhys in Devon, and if I happened to be in the vicinity of the grave of someone whose life or work had meant a lot to me, then of course I'd take a look and pay my respects. But this was absolutely the last time I'd make a special effort to do so. We stayed less than 5 minutes, got back on the tram, and a few days later onto a sleeper train to Cusey, where we failed to get off in time. We had lots of bags. The attendant looking after passengers in our carriage was nowhere to be seen, and I couldn't work out how to open the door. The train barely stopped, just paused for a few seconds before starting off again, so we had to stay on till Orvieto, which was only 20 minutes away, but there was no train back to Cusey for 2.5 hours. It was 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning. There were no taxis, and I was in such a rage, filled with such hatred of the world, I said to my wife, that I was going to smash my head through the window of the wretched station cafe and tear my throat to shreds on the shards of glass. I meant it too, but the time passed quite quickly, and we got back on the train to Cusey, lugging all our luggage. At Cusey, there were plenty of taxis, and in half an hour we were eating the breakfast we should have been eating 3 hours earlier at the boutique hotel in the Tuscan countryside where we had stayed once before, 12 years earlier, and where, this time around, I ended up lying in a field listening to the slow movement of opus 132. The string quartet in A minor was composed between February and July 1825, with a month-long interruption in April when Beethoven was suffering from a severe abdominal illness. In a Nietzschean way, this was a blessing, since it led to the slow movement with its lengthy explanatory subtitle, Holy Song of Thanksgiving from a Convalescent to the Deity in the Lydian Mode. That may be what it says on the packet, but it's not what I hear. Inwards, as if into the distance, was the phrase a friend used to evoke Nietzsche's peculiar gaze. And what I hear is a valediction like that, at once inward and cosmically vast. Another slow movement from a quartet written in the second half of 1825, the Cavatina from opus 130, was among the pieces of music included on the Golden Records when the Voyager space probes were launched in 1977. I remember how moved I was in 2012 when it was confirmed that Voyager 1 had passed into interstellar space. In The Farthest, a documentary about the mission, one of the team members at NASA recounts how she cried when this man-made object passed beyond the heliosphere. My friend John Ray couldn't see what all the fuss was about, since it meant that nothing interesting would ever happen to Voyager again, which may be why so many of us felt so strongly. What does this image of Voyager leaving everything behind have to do with Beethoven's labelling the slow movement of Opus 132 as the experience of a convalescent? Overwhelmingly conscious of a return to health, the convalescent rejoices in gradually returning strength, is full of a reawakened faith in a tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, of a sudden sense and anticipation of a future, of impending adventures, of seas that are open again. The words are Nietzsche's, whose frequent bouts of ill health meant that his life was spent in a state of constantly renewed convalescence and relapse. If the return to health is seen as a prelude to impending adventure, why does this song of thanks by Beethoven sound so elegiac? Assuming that the composer can't be looking back fondly on the experience of sickness, it becomes an elegy in advance of eventual release and departure from the myriad vexations which Beethoven itemized and moaned about so frequently, of being alive, of being on earth. Could it be that Beethoven's thanks are offered in anticipation of and longing for nothing interesting ever happening again? The music struggles to free itself from the laws of its own gravity, a force created in part by these very exertions to achieve a condition of weightlessness. There are two alternating elements to the Heiliger: the slow hymn or chorale and a jaunty dance tune marked "Feeling New Strength." We hear the return of the chorale more and more faintly, but also more and more insistently. It is, by the end, almost a memory of how it originated, where it came from. The alternating dance is also heard repeatedly, but its claims on our attention diminish with each recurrence. Its purported strength weakens. In the chorale, the memories of all the things that have happened prove increasingly difficult to let go, even as they fade. The song of thanks is for all that has been.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.